Something about Steven Universe fusions feels like the kind of topic you could talk about for hours without really meaning to. You sit down to think about one of them, Garnet, probably because she's the obvious place to start, and then you realize you need to explain Ruby and Sapphire first, and then you need a bit of Homeworld context to make that land properly. And then, somewhere around the third tangent about forced fusions and what the cluster actually is, you notice it's well past midnight and there's a cold cup of tea next to you that you forgot about entirely somewhere around Malachite. That's sort of what tonight is. In the best possible way, hopefully. We're going to go through every major fusion in Steven Universe. What they are, who makes them up, what they mean, and why the show puts so much genuine thought into each one. This isn't designed to be a brisk watch. It's the kind of thing you put on when you want something interesting in the background, something with real content to it without being urgent about any of it. The sections are all self-contained, so if you drift off somewhere in the middle, that's fine. That's the point, more or less. I've always thought the fusions are one of the most quietly clever things the show does. On the surface, a fusion is just two characters combining into a stronger one, which is a familiar enough concept in animation. If you grew up watching a certain kind of magical girl anime, you'll recognize the basic shape of it. But in Steven Universe, the strength thing is almost never actually the point. The fusion is always about the relationship between the components. What kind of bond they have. What they need from each other. What they're afraid of. What they bring out in each other that wouldn't exist otherwise. Every fusion is different because every relationship is different, and the show commits to that completely and consistently, even in moments that don't get a lot of attention. Some of them are joyful, some are genuinely unsettling, some are heartbreaking in ways that take a moment to fully land, and some are just very funny in the specific, gentle way the show does well. We'll get to all of it. If you've seen Steven Universe already, hopefully some of this gives you things to sit with that didn't fully click on first watch. A lot of the fusions are richer the second time around, especially once you know how certain character arcs resolve. And if you haven't seen the show at all, you might still enjoy just listening. The lore holds up on its own. There's a subscribe button somewhere on screen if you like more of this kind of thing on the channel. Right. Let's start at the beginning, which is almost inevitably Garnet. Before we get into the individual fusions, it's worth spending a bit of time on what the show's actually doing with them. Because if you go in treating fusions purely as power-ups, a mechanism for making the characters temporarily stronger, you'll technically be right some of the time, but you'll miss most of what makes them interesting. Rebecca Sugar has talked in various interviews about the core intention behind fusion, and the heart of it is that fusion is a metaphor for relationships, any kind of relationship. Romantic love, deep friendship, codependency, abuse, healing, the accidental discoveries that change everything. The visual conceit of two characters literally becoming a third entity is a way of showing what a relationship actually does to the people inside it. You change. You become something that didn't exist before. And depending on the quality of that relationship, the thing you become is either genuinely beautiful or quite troubling, and sometimes both at once. And the show doesn't pretend otherwise. What triggers a fusion in the show is worth thinking about. It requires physical coordination, usually a shared dance of some kind, though the specific form of that varies considerably, as well as emotional alignment and some degree of mental openness to the other person. All three elements need to be present at the same time. If any one of them is off, the fusion either doesn't form or falls apart partway through. It's a slightly inconvenient requirement if you want a quick fusion in an emergency situation, which the show does occasionally use for comedic effect, but as an analogy for how genuinely difficult authentic connection is in practice, it tracks remarkably well. One of the things the show is careful and consistent about: a fusion is not two people sharing a body. It's a genuinely separate entity. A third person with their own personality, their own way of moving and speaking, sometimes their own name, their own sense of humor, their own blind spots. Garnet is not Ruby and Sapphire pretending to be one person. Garnet is Garnet. Ruby and Sapphire are the components who make Garnet possible, but Garnet exists in her own right, and the distinction matters quite a lot. The show returns to it repeatedly, And when characters try to reduce a fusion to just the sum of its parts, that framing is treated as a failure of understanding, not as a neutral, accurate description. There's a visual design logic running through all of the fusions that becomes quite elegant once you start to notice it. The more gem components involved, the more physically unusual the resulting fusion tends to be. Extra eyes, extra arms, extra mouths, forms that don't quite conform to what you'd expect from a humanoid figure. And the nature of that physical unusualness seems to correspond to the nature of the relationship, rather than simply scaling linearly with the number of gems. A stable, deeply loving fusion like Garnet has a third eye, but it sits naturally on her face. It doesn't look wrong, it looks like it belongs. More strained or chaotic fusions tend to have features that feel less integrated. Extra eyes placed awkwardly, limbs that don't quite fit together. Something about the proportions that creates a vague background sense of wrongness before you consciously identify why. Sugilite has 5 eyes, 4 arms, and fangs, which looks genuinely monstrous, and the show means that deliberately. The form reflects the nature of the combination. It's subtle in its application, but consistent across the entire run of the show. There's also a color mixing logic to the designs that's satisfying in a quiet way. Fusions blend the skin tones, hair colors, and general palettes of their components into things that are visually clear without being mechanical. Once you know what to look for, you can usually identify which gems made a given fusion, which makes every fusion feel like an extension of the characters you already know rather than an entirely separate creation. A casting detail worth noting before we get into specifics. The major crystal gem fusions are almost exclusively voiced by musicians rather than traditional voice actors. Garnet is voiced by Estelle, a British R&B singer, and that casting choice alone tells you something about the character's energy before she says a word. Opal is voiced by Amy Mann, whose particular brand of melancholic folk suits Opal's dreamy detachment. Sugilite is voiced by Nicki Minaj, Stevonnie by A. J. Mikulka, Sardonyx by Alexia Kadim. The reasoning behind this seems to be partly connected to the musicality of fusion itself. Fusions emerge from synchronized rhythmic movement, so having actual musicians voice them reinforces that at a level below the plot, and partly because musicians bring a quality of presence to a performance that theatrical training doesn't always produce in the same way. The last bit of context before we start. There's a tension that runs through all of the fusion lore in the show, which is the contrast between how Homeworld views fusion and how the crystal gems view it. On Homeworld, the gem civilization that created all of these characters, same type fusion is considered normal and functional. 2 identical gems combined for a task, unfuse when it's done, and no one thinks much of it. Cross-type fusion, fusion between gems of genuinely different kinds, is considered taboo, shameful, possibly illegal depending on context and era. The idea that 2 different gems might choose to fuse for reasons beyond utility, might stay fused because they want to, is genuinely unsettling to Homeworld's social structure, which is built on the premise that every gem knows exactly what it is and remains in its designated category indefinitely. The crystal gems disagree with this view quite strongly, and a lot of what we're going to discuss tonight exists in direct conversation with that disagreement, as a challenge to it, a consequence of it, or a living argument against it. One last note before we start properly. The fusion metaphor in this show is unusually resilient because it works in multiple directions simultaneously. It works as a positive metaphor for love, connection, chosen family, the ways people become more than themselves together. It works as a cautionary one for codependency, addiction to the feeling of connection, the difference between wanting to be with someone and wanting what being with them gives you. And it works as a horror metaphor in the forced fusions and the cluster, for violation and instrumentalization, and what we do to beings we've decided don't count as individuals. The same concept carries all of those meanings without collapsing, and that's because the show keeps the underlying logic consistent. Fusion reflects the relationship, every time. The metaphor is flexible because it's honest. Right. That's the frame. Let's get into it. If you ask most people to name a Steven Universe fusion, they say Garnet, which makes sense because Garnet is present from the very first episode, and for the better part of 2 seasons, a significant portion of the audience had no idea she was a fusion at all. She just seemed like a very cool, extremely competent, slightly enigmatic character who punched things very hard and occasionally made gnomic statements about feelings, which she is all of those things, but there's considerably more to it than that. To understand Garnet properly, you need to understand Ruby and Sapphire as individuals first, because they're about as different as 2 beings can be while still being capable of finding each other. Sapphire is aristocratic by Homeworld standards. She has periwinkle blue skin, a single large eye that she keeps covered by her long pale blue hair, which, once you know the eye is there, feels like a very specific visual statement about how she moves through the world. She served in Blue Diamond's court as something like a court prophet. Her gem type possesses future vision, the ability to see probable outcomes with reasonable accuracy. On Homeworld, this made her valuable in the specific way that useful tools are valuable, respected at a distance, consulted when needed, not particularly considered as an individual beyond her function. She was the kind of gem who had learned to hold the present at arm's length because she was always already looking past it. Ruby is, by contrast, one of the most common gem types on Homeworld. Rubies are the military's foot soldiers, small, red, deployed in groups, interchangeable by design. They're not supposed to have complex inner lives, and they're not encouraged to develop them. Ruby is impulsive, hot-headed, and reactive, someone who exists entirely in the current moment, leading with feeling rather than calculation, acting before she has time to think about whether acting is wise. The show implies quite gently that rubies aren't given much cause to reflect on themselves or their circumstances. They have a job. The job is simple. That's the arrangement. In temperament, they're almost perfectly opposed. Sapphire is still, analytical, reserved. Someone who has learned, perhaps, to hold back because she can already see several futures unfolding and doesn't always know which one she's in. Ruby is immediate, passionate, entirely present to whatever she's feeling. When you describe them that way, the idea that they'd form a stable and enduring fusion sounds counterintuitive. They don't have obviously complementary skill sets. They don't share a background. They don't even occupy the same level of Homeworld's hierarchy. And yet, the show suggests, quite consistently, that these particular opposites are not in tension, but in conversation. Sapphire's tendency to accept what she's foreseen, to treat the future as already settled, needs Ruby's insistence on acting in the present moment as though the future is still being made. Ruby's tendency to act on feeling without calculation needs Sapphire's capacity to hold the larger picture. Neither of them has access to what the other has alone, which means Garnet has access to something neither of them could provide independently. She can act with conviction on incomplete information. She can feel deeply and still see the strategic context. She can lead from both instinct and analysis simultaneously. It's not that Ruby and Sapphire balance each other out in the sense of canceling each other's extremes. It's that they complete each other in the sense of providing what the other couldn't generate alone. Which makes it interesting that the thing that brought them together wasn't any of this. It wasn't a calculated decision, not a recognition of complementarity, not anything planned at all. The accident happened approximately 5,750 years ago, during Blue Diamond's colonization operation on Earth. A group of diplomats had been dispatched to address the Crystal Gem rebellion that was interfering with Homeworld's plans. Sapphire was among them, there to deliver a prophecy. She had already seen how the confrontation was going to unfold. Pearl would attack, some rebels would be captured, the mission would proceed. She'd accepted this vision as the fixed future, the way sapphires sometimes accept fixed futures, as already done, not requiring intervention. One of her 3 Ruby bodyguards had not accepted this at all. Ruby saw Pearl raising a weapon toward Sapphire and jumped in front of her. No calculation, no strategic assessment, no moment of weighing consequences. Just the immediate, impulsive, characteristically Ruby response of getting between the threat and the person she was supposed to protect. Their hands made contact, and in that moment of physical proximity and raw emotional intensity, one being acting impulsively out of protectiveness toward another, something happened that apparently had never happened before in gem history, or at least in any gem's living memory. They fused. A ruby and a sapphire, two entirely different gem types, combining into a third entity that had no established category. Blue Diamond's court erupted. Cross-type fusion was deeply taboo, shameful, disturbing, contrary to the natural order as Homeworld understood it. Ruby was immediately sentenced to be shattered, and Sapphire, who could presumably have stood aside and allowed this to happen, who had after all seen the future and accepted it, grabbed Ruby and jumped off the platform. They landed on Earth. They found somewhere quiet. And in the episode The Answer, which is technically a Season 2 episode, structured as Garnet telling Steven the story of how Ruby and Sapphire met, framed as a birthday midnight present, delivered as something close to a bedtime story, we see what came next. Ruby was devastated. She was convinced she'd ruined Sapphire's life through impulsiveness, that she'd derailed the prophecy, that she should be ashamed of herself for the accident of the fusion. This is very Ruby. The intensity of the self-criticism matches the intensity of the original impulse. Sapphire was confused and moved in a way she didn't have immediate language for, which was an unusual position for someone who usually had access to information about what was coming. They explored Earth together for a while, getting to know each other properly for the first time, and eventually they sang something entirely new, a song about the discovery that what you've stumbled into might be something extraordinary rather than something terrible. They fused again. Garnet, still getting used to the experience of being herself, stumbled down a hill and fell into Rose Quartz and Pearl. And this is where Rose Quartz does one of the most significant things she does in the entire show, which is also one of the simplest. She doesn't recoil. She doesn't ask cautious questions. She doesn't treat Garnet as a curiosity or a diplomatic problem. She asks how Garnet feels. And when Garnet says she feels lost and scared and happy, Rose welcomes her to Earth, tells her she's already the answer to whatever questions she might be asking. The show is careful not to oversell this moment. Rose doesn't deliver a speech. She just makes Garnet feel like she doesn't have to justify existing. And that, apparently, was what Ruby and Sapphire had been missing. Not permission exactly, but the absence of anyone telling them they were wrong. Garnet chooses to remain fused. Not strategically. Not because the math of power and capability works out better, but because being Garnet feels right. And on Earth with the crystal gems, she's allowed to remain who she is. Her personality as a fusion is a genuine synthesis of her components, which is what the best fusions always are. The calm on the surface is Sapphire's analytical quality, filtered through Ruby's passionate warmth into something that reads as steadiness rather than coldness. The deep feeling underneath is Ruby's intensity, shaped by Sapphire's precision into something that can be held and directed rather than just expressed. She leads with quiet authority because she has Sapphire's strategic mind and Ruby's conviction that things genuinely matter. When she expresses her feelings, it lands, because Ruby doesn't do things by halves. Her powers reflect the same logic. Sapphire's future vision comes through in Garnet's ability to make decisions on partial information with full conviction. The filter of Ruby's impulsiveness seems to make the vision more probabilistic. She sees possibilities rather than certainties, which is interesting because individual Sapphires tend to have a more deterministic relationship with the future. She has combat gauntlets, formidable physical strength, and 3 eyes. All of it integrates smoothly into a coherent design because the relationship underlying it is coherent. After Rose Quartz gives up her physical form to give birth to Steven, Garnet becomes the de facto leader of the crystal gems. There's something very Garnet about how this transition happens. Without ceremony, without announcement, without extended agonizing about whether she's the right person, the most capable person who cared most about the mission got on with it. The reveal for viewers comes in the Season 1 finale, Jailbreak. Jasper had separated the crystal gems into individual cells, which forced Ruby and Sapphire apart. They eventually find each other, refuse, and then Garnet sings Stronger Than You, which remains one of the finest songs the show produced, doing more character work in 3 minutes than most episodes manage in 22. The foreshadowing had been there for careful viewers. The third eye, certain turns of phrase, moments where Garnet seemed to be working for more information than she should have. Even viewers who'd suspected found the execution satisfying. The answer comes later, in Season 2, and is formally beautiful. The art style takes on a slightly storybook quality. The structure is that of a birthday gift, and emotionally direct in a way the show sometimes circles around rather than landing on directly. The central exchange, Rose telling Garnet she's already the answer to her own questions, and Garnet later telling Steven that the answer was love, is one of those moments that accumulates meaning every time you return to it. Ruby and Sapphire eventually get married in the Season 5 episode Reunited. The wedding is a full cast event and was celebrated widely when it aired, partly for its cultural significance as one of the more prominent depictions of a lesbian relationship in animation aimed at children, and partly because it was simply very good. What I find most interesting about it, beyond either of those things, is that it doesn't change what Ruby and Sapphire are to each other. Garnet has always been a love story. The marriage makes something that was always true official. The cultural significance is worth naming clearly. Garnet was, for several years, one of the most visible depictions of a queer relationship in mainstream animation, and the show handled it with a consistency and sincerity that made it meaningful rather than decorative. Estelle's performance brings a warmth and groundedness to the character that makes the representation feel like a genuine creative choice rather than an afterthought. Garnet matters because she's a well-written character, and the representation follows naturally from that. One more thing about Garnet that I think is worth noting, which is how the show handles the question of her identity in relation to her components. There are moments across the series where Ruby and Sapphire unfuse, sometimes by choice, sometimes by force, and each time there's a slightly strange quality to watching them be separate. Not because anything is wrong with Ruby or Sapphire individually. They're both fully formed characters with their own personalities and their own stories to tell. But there's a quality of Garnet that isn't reducible to them, and its absence is felt when they're apart. Garnet herself addresses this at several points, most directly in interactions with Steven about what she is. She speaks about herself in the first person as Garnet, not as Ruby and Sapphire together. She refers to her components sometimes in the third person as though describing people she contains rather than people she is. And this is treated by the show as entirely coherent, not as a contradiction. She is Garnet. Ruby and Sapphire are also real. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and they're not in conflict with each other. The fusion is a third thing without negating the people who make it possible. This has a quiet implication for the rest of the fusions we'll discuss. Even when a fusion is temporary, even when it dissolves and the components go back to being themselves, something about the experience of having been that fusion is real and remains. Opal existed for a while, and then Pearl and Amethyst were themselves, again. But they were still the Pearl and Amethyst who had been Opal together. The experience leaves traces. The show acknowledges this without dwelling on it, which is the right approach. It would be heavy-handed to make it explicit every time, but the logic is there. She's the reason the rest of this show's fusion lore works. If Garnet had been framed as a power-up, two characters becoming temporarily stronger, none of what follows would have been possible. The show had to establish clearly and early that fusion is something else entirely. Garnet is the proof of concept. Everything else we're discussing tonight is built on the foundation she represents. Pearl and Amethyst do not, on the face of it, have a great deal in common. Pearl is precise, anxious, and self-critical. She was, before the Crystal Gem Rebellion, a pearl owned by Pink Diamond, a servant gem designed to be graceful and obedient and to stand beside her owner, looking elegant and anticipating needs. The rebellion gave her the opportunity to become something else, and she did. but the pattern stayed with her. Perfectionism, a sense of self-worth structured around being useful to someone, a tendency to measure her own value against an external standard rather than an internal one. Pearl's character arc across the show is largely about the slow, difficult work of figuring out who she is when she's not defined by her relationship to someone else. Amethyst is almost exactly the opposite kind of complicated. She lives entirely in the present tense. She doesn't hold grudges or carry long-term anxieties because both of those things require maintaining a continuous relationship with time, which isn't really her way. She eats everything, shapeshifts constantly, makes friends easily, picks up and abandons enthusiasms with equal energy. She was made in Earth's kindergarten, an extraction process rather than the natural incubation most gems go through. And she came out later than she was supposed to, smaller than expected, and has spent most of her life with a quiet background certainty that this means something bad about her. She does an excellent job of not showing it most of the time, which is its own kind of effort. These two rub each other the wrong way consistently. Pearl finds Amethyst irresponsible and chaotic. Amethyst finds Pearl uptight and condescending. Both of them are sometimes right about the other and often wrong in specifics, and neither of them is especially good at expressing what they actually need from the other person. And yet, when they manage to get on the same page long enough to fuse, they produce Opal, who is serene, gentle, nearly transcendently peaceful, wielding a longbow with the focused calm of someone who has been doing this for centuries and sees no particular reason to hurry. The first time we see Opal is in the Season 1 episode Giant Woman, which is really an episode about the concept of fusion, generally, and about this fusion specifically. Steven is desperate to see Pearl and Amethyst fuse. He's heard about Opal, thinks she sounds extraordinary, keeps asking. Both of them are reluctant in their different ways. Pearl because fusion requires genuine alignment and the conditions need to be right. Amethyst partly out of contrariness, partly because she's not entirely sure she wants to be that close to Pearl and all her opinions about things. Eventually they manage it. The conditions come together, and Opal is wonderful, graceful, powerful, unhurried, exactly the kind of fusion you'd want on your side. And then she completely forgets why she came. The mission was to retrieve the Heaven Beetle. Opal rescues Steven from immediate danger, which was urgent and necessary, and she does beautifully, and then becomes absorbed in the moment and doesn't think about the beetle at all. This is apparently a known Opal problem. The Garnet Companion guidebook to the show explains the logic. You might expect that combining Pearl's single-minded focus with Amethyst's present-mindedness would produce something chaotic. What actually happens is that Amethyst's complete immersion in the present moment meets Pearl's ability to focus intensely on whatever is immediately in front of her. And together they produce a balance so profound and so peaceful that Opal can lose track of the larger context entirely. She achieves the immediate thing with extraordinary precision. She just occasionally forgets what the larger thing was. Her weapon is one of the more elegant in the show. A longbow formed from Pearl's spear and Amethyst's whip. Pearl's spear serves as the body of the bow, Amethyst's whip as the string. The arrows echo Pearl's energy blasts. It's graceful and precise and slightly unusual as a combat weapon compared to the brute force some of the other fusions deploy, and it suits the character well. Opal fights the way Pearl fights, with care and precision, and she enjoys it the way Amethyst enjoys things, which gives the combination a quality the individual components don't quite have. She's voiced by Amy Mann, which is a casting choice that makes complete sense once you hear it. Amy Mann has a very specific quality to her voice, a little bit sad, a little bit wise, not quite fully present in the everyday world, that maps perfectly onto Opal's dreamy detachment. There are moments where Opal sounds almost like she's narrating her own actions from a slight distance, and Amy Mann's delivery suits that quality. Opal shows up in a few other places across the series, but never has an episode centered entirely on her in the way that Sugilite and Sardonyx do. There's something fitting about that. Opal is the fusion of two people who are still actively working through a complicated dynamic, who have grown considerably closer by the end of the show, but remain fundamentally quite different from each other. She's rare and slightly elusive, appearing when Pearl and Amethyst are truly in sync, which is possible but takes effort, and then fading back when the moment passes. What Opal says about Pearl and Amethyst is something the show makes visible through her existence rather than stating directly. Apparent incompatibility doesn't preclude genuine complementarity. Pearl's precision doesn't cancel Amethyst's impulsiveness. Amethyst's present-mindedness doesn't cancel Pearl's capacity for focus. Each of them has something the other lacks and can't fully develop alone, and Opal is what that looks like when they're willing to be in the same space together and stop protecting themselves from each other quite so hard. She's also beautiful, which seems worth noting. The four-armed longbow-wielding giant with Rapunzel-length white hair and a serene expression is one of the most visually distinctive fusions in the show, and the design manages to make her feel like she belongs to both components without looking like a simple blend of them. And there's something in Opal's rarity that carries its own meaning. Pearl and Amethyst fuse as Opal rarely because fusing as Opal requires them to genuinely be on the same page, not just professionally cooperative, not just tolerating each other, but actually in sync in a way that demands something real from both of them. The show treats this honestly rather than making it easy. Not every relationship produces a stable fusion every time you try. Some relationships require more work to achieve the synchronization needed. The fact that Opal is rare isn't a statement that Pearl and Amethyst's bond is weak. It's an acknowledgement that certain kinds of connection are difficult, and the difficulty is part of what makes them worth having. Sugilite is the fusion the show uses to start asking difficult questions. Not about whether fusion is good, the show is clear enough on that, but about what happens when fusion becomes the point in itself rather than a means to something else. The setup is the Coach Steven episode in Season 1. The crystal gems need to demolish a communications hub, a large physical structure, lots of debris to move. Purely manual work requiring strength more than anything else. Pearl is assigned to look after Steven while Garnet and Amethyst stay back to handle it as Sugilite. The logic is straightforward. This is heavy work. Sugilite is enormously powerful. This is the right tool for this situation. Off they go. Except Sugilite doesn't stop when the work is done. She keeps going. She doesn't want to unfuse. And when Pearl comes back to check on things, Sugilite is not particularly interested in anyone else's agenda. Sugilite's personality is the direct result of combining Garnet's raw power with Amethyst's unrestrained ID. Garnet, as a permanent fusion, has learned to hold the more intense aspects of Ruby and Sapphire's personalities in careful balance. That balance is part of what makes Garnet stable. But that balance doesn't carry over when she fuses with Amethyst, because Garnet is inside the fusion now rather than maintaining perspective from outside it. What emerges is Amethyst's impulsiveness and desire for power with none of the tempering influence Garnet usually brings, and Amethyst's deeply buried conviction that she's never quite enough, that she needs to prove something, that being the most powerful version of herself is the closest thing to being enough, finds in Sugilite a temporary relief from all of that. Why would you voluntarily give that up? She's enormous. 5 eyes, 4 arms, fangs. She moves and sounds like someone who has completely committed to the idea that size and force are the primary ways of relating to the world. She's voiced by Nicki Minaj, and the casting is exactly right. That register of aggressive, charismatic confidence, the delivery that sits at the intersection of swagger and genuine threat, fits the character without requiring you to explain it. The episode's most interesting choice is making Pearl the one who has to stop her. Pearl is physically the weakest of the crystal gems. She is, in terms of brute force, completely outmatched. Sugilite is enormous and in no mood to be reasoned with, and Pearl knows this. She manages it anyway, through strategy and genuine bravery, and it's one of Pearl's better moments in the early seasons. An underdog win that the show gives her clearly and without hedging. The aftermath settles into something a bit more complicated. Amethyst feels guilty about it and doesn't fully admit that, which is very characteristic. Garnet is measured in a way that suggests she understands what happened from the inside. Steven, who had been enthusiastically encouraging Sugilite's behavior earlier in the episode, has to sit with the realization that his enthusiasm contributed to the problem. What the episode is examining, and what the show uses Sugilite to keep examining in later appearances, is the idea that fusion can be addictive, not in a loose metaphorical sense, but in something more literal. Being fused grants access to a version of yourself that is bigger and more capable, and feels substantially different from your ordinary experience, and that difference can be hard to voluntarily relinquish. Garnet acknowledges this directly at least once. The show frames it as a genuine risk rather than a moral failing. The problem isn't wanting to fuse, the problem is when staying fused stops being an expression of the relationship and starts being about the power or the feeling rather than the person you're fused with. Sugilite's weapon is Garnet's gauntlets fused with Amethyst's whip, the gauntlets serving as mace heads, the whip as the rope, forming an enormous flail. It's a satisfying design. Both component weapons are recognizable in it, and the combination makes physical and logical sense, which not all fusion weapons manage quite as neatly. She appears again in Know Your Fusion in Season 4, where she is rendered as a kind of holographic benchmark in Sardonyx's game show evaluation of Smoky Quartz. Even as a hologram, she's slightly intimidating. There's nothing in that episode that changes or complicates what we already know about Sugilite. She simply is what she is, which is a representation of what happens when power is sought for its own sake rather than in service of connection. Sugilite is the show's honest acknowledgement that the things it celebrates come with genuine risks. Fusion is wonderful. Being seen and knowing someone well enough to be them together, that's worth celebrating. And it also creates a specific vulnerability, which is that the experience of being more than yourself can become something you pursue for that alone. The distinction between I want to be close to you and I want to be larger and more powerful than I am is one the show keeps returning to, and Sugilite is the clearest early illustration of why the distinction matters. Here's an interesting counterpoint to Sugilite. Sardonyx is also Garnet fused with another crystal gem, and she's also used to examine what happens when fusion goes wrong. But the wrongness in this case is much quieter, and in some ways harder to sit with than Sugilite's obvious physical chaos, because it doesn't look like wrongness at first. It looks like a very good time. Sardonyx is the fusion of Garnet and Pearl, and she first appears in the Cry for Help arc in Season 3. The setup. A Homeworld communications tower has been rebuilt and is broadcasting a signal, and the crystal gems need to keep destroying it. Garnet and Pearl fuse as Sardonyx to demolish it, and it's wonderful. Sardonyx is theatrical, precise, and clearly genuinely fun for both of them. Steven is delighted. Everything seems entirely fine. It isn't, quite. Pearl has been rebuilding the tower herself, not out of malice, not out of any desire to harm the mission or anyone in it, but because fusing with Garnet as Sardonyx is one of the few things that makes Pearl feel truly confident, truly capable, truly seen in a way that her ordinary life doesn't consistently provide. She rebuilds the tower so there will be a reason to fuse again. She does it multiple times before anyone realizes. What makes the Cry for Help arc work as well as it does is that Pearl's motivation is completely comprehensible. She's sympathetic throughout, even as the thing she's doing is clearly wrong. She's someone who has spent a very long time with a sense of self built around being useful to someone else. First Pink Diamond, then Rose Quartz, and who found in Sardonyx something that felt like a genuine respite from the exhaustion of that. The problem isn't that she wants to fuse with Garnet. The problem is that she did it by deceiving Garnet, by manufacturing a false reason for the fusion without Garnet's knowledge or consent. She turned something Garnet considers sacred into a means to an end. Garnet's response is one of the show's more quietly devastating moments. She doesn't explode. She isn't violent. She is simply, for a while, unable to forgive it, which lands harder than anger would have to Garnet. Fusion is the most personal thing possible. It is, in the most literal sense, her entire existence. Her relationship with Ruby and Sapphire, the thing she is. Having that used as a tool, even by someone she cares about, even without cruelty intended, is a genuine violation. The arc resolves, but it takes real time and real work on Pearl's part, and the show doesn't move past it quickly. Sardonyx herself. She's a showman, completely and unapologetically. She moves as though she's aware of being watched, which she usually is, and she enjoys it without embarrassment. She speaks in a cadence that suggests she trained for stages and is applying all of that now to everything she does, including casual conversation. She has a war hammer as her primary weapon, Pearl's spear serving as the handle, Garnet's gauntlets forming the mace head, which is a weapon combination that shouldn't work as neatly as it does and yet makes complete sense. She has 4 arms, 2 sets of eyes, and joints that rotate independently of the rest of her body, which she uses to spin herself in ways that are simultaneously impressive and mildly unsettling. She is voiced by Alexia Kadaim, a musical theater actress, and the casting is exactly right. Sardonyx sounds like someone who has learned performance as a second language and now speaks it more fluently than anything else. There's a bit in Know Your Fusion, the season 4 episode where Sardonyx hosts a game show evaluation of Smoky Quartz, where she's completely committed to the presentation, complete with theme music and a studio audience format, and the full energy of someone who believes this is the right venue for this conversation. She is entirely sincere about all of it. Know Your Fusion is interesting for what it reveals about Sardonyx beyond the performance, though. She sets the evaluation criteria against the other Garnet component fusions, Sugilite's brute strength, Opal's precision, and the standard she establishes is impossible for Smoky to meet, set up in a way that ensures failure from the start. Sardonyx keeps the tone relentlessly positive throughout, keeps pushing for the hidden talent, keeps believing genuinely that there's something extraordinary she just hasn't found yet. And she doesn't realize, until she's made it impossible not to notice, that Smoky has stopped joking and started genuinely collapsing under the pressure. It lands because the episode has been careful to show that Sardonyx's showmanship isn't hollow. She really does care about finding the good thing, she really does want to help. Caring doesn't automatically mean understanding what someone actually needs in a given moment, and that's the lesson of this episode as much as it was the lesson of the Cry for Help arc. Sardonyx, at her best, is one of the most joyful fusions in the show. But the performance, the energy, the theatricality, these are also in certain contexts ways of not quite connecting. What Sardonyx tells you about Pearl and Garnet's relationship, 2 profoundly different personalities who respect each other enormously and don't always fully understand each other. Their fusion is genuinely wonderful when it's freely formed. And the Cry for Help arc is the demonstration that genuine care for someone doesn't protect you from the specific ways your own needs can lead you to treat them badly. The arc resolves. They find their way back. Sardonyx, in later appearances, formed freely and happily, is the evidence that 2 people can work through something genuinely difficult and still find joy in each other afterwards. There's something in the Sardonyx arc that distinguishes it from the Sugilite arc in a way worth making explicit, because they're both stories about fusion used badly, and they arrive at quite different emotional registers. Sugilite's problem is about power, the experience of being enormous and capable, and not wanting to return to being smaller. That's understandable in a relatively direct way. Sardonyx's problem is about loneliness, and specifically the loneliness of someone who doesn't quite know how to find their own worth without external confirmation. Pearl's manipulation of the situation isn't about wanting power. It's about wanting to feel, even briefly, like the person Sardonyx lets her be. Someone competent and seen and genuinely capable of great things. The tragedy of it is that she is that person. The show has been showing us Pearl's competence since the first episode. She just can't quite access that knowledge from inside her own perspective. And Sardonyx is where she found the shortcut. And shortcuts to self-worth are never as good as the real thing, and they tend to cost the people around you. Alexandrite is the crystal gem's fully combined form, Garnet, Pearl, and Amethyst together, and she appears twice in the main series in circumstances that illuminate quite different things about what this particular combination means. The first appearance is Fusion Cuisine, a season 1 episode, where Steven has told Connie's parents that his family is normal and they want to have dinner with them. The solution Steven arrives at, not one of his more considered plans, is to have all three crystal gems fuse into a single person who can plausibly pass as his mother. This works in the technical sense that Alexandrite is present and vaguely humanoid. It does not work in the sense that Alexandrite has 4 mouths that cannot agree on food. The episode is funny in the way the show does situational comedy. A slowly escalating disaster, each new complication building on the last until the entire premise is unsustainable. And it's also emotionally honest in its way, because the farce exposes something real. Alexandrite can't maintain the fiction of being a normal mother at a normal dinner because Garnet, Pearl, and Amethyst are not in perfect alignment. They're functional and genuine as a team. They're not identical, and Connie's parents' very reasonable questions about preferences and habits and family history keep finding the exact seams where the 3 personalities diverge. A 6-armed giant woman who breathes fire at the dinner table when the fusion starts breaking down is technically the most dramatic way a first impression has ever gone wrong on this show, which is an achievement. The second significant appearance is Super Watermelon Island in Season 3, which is the episode where Malachite, Lapis, and Jasper's fusion finally breaks free from her imprisonment. Alexandrite is the appropriate response, a full combat deployment, 6 arms cycling through every available weapon, switching between Opal's bow, Sugilite's flail, and Sardonyx's warhammer mid-fight, using Pearl's spear and Amethyst's whip individually as well, and then she breathes fire at Malachite. The fire breathing is worth dwelling on because it's one of the more quietly interesting details in the show's fusion design. The fire is unique to Alexandrite. It doesn't come from Pearl, who has no fire abilities. It doesn't come from Amethyst, who doesn't either. It doesn't come from Garnet, whose component abilities are more about electricity and ice and future vision. It's something that only exists in the specific combination of these 3. An emergent ability, a power that couldn't exist any other way, that arises from the particular meeting of these specific personalities and gem types in sufficient combination. The show uses this detail to make a point about what fusion can produce that goes beyond stronger version of the components. At a certain level of combination, genuinely new things appear. Not just increased strength, not just the sum of individual abilities, something that wasn't there before and couldn't have been. Alexandrite breathes fire because Alexandrite is something none of her components are. And the fire is proof of that. She is voiced by Rita Rani Ahuja, and the voice has registers that recall each component without being dominated by any of them. Moments that feel like Pearl, moments that feel more like Garnet. The occasional amethyst quality flash, while still being distinctly Alexandrite when it's working. A design note worth mentioning. Alexandrite has what appears to be a second face embedded within her larger facial structure, a mask quality that echoes the crystal temple itself, which is modeled on Obsidian but has a similar layered face aesthetic. There's also a second mouth along her jawline, lower than her primary face, visible primarily when she breathes fire or when the fusion starts to break down and each component begins asserting its own expression separately. What Alexandrite says about the crystal gems as a group is that they genuinely work together. They have for thousands of years, across genuinely difficult circumstances. And that working relationship is real and enduring. But they are not identical. And the fusion reflects this. Fusion cuisine isn't a failure of the crystal gems. It's a portrait of 3 beings who are genuinely different and genuinely functional together, who can hold things together when it matters. Even if dinner with Connie's parents is apparently a different category of challenge than fighting Malachite. There's also something in fusion cuisine about what Alexandrite's instability reveals beyond the comedy. The situation that breaks her down isn't combat, isn't a physical threat, isn't anything that the crystal gems have been trained to handle. It's a fundamentally social situation with no enemy to face and no clear objective to achieve. Just a table, and questions, and the requirement to seem like a coherent family unit to a pair of very reasonable adults who deserve accurate information. Alexandrite can fight Malachite, because fighting is a context where Garnet's authority naturally leads and Pearl and Amethyst can follow that lead. There's no equivalent leading force in a social situation, and so the 3 voices inside her keep asserting themselves independently rather than deferring, and the fusion phrase. The real family dinner, later in the show, when Connie's parents do eventually meet the crystal gems properly, as themselves, goes considerably better. Because by then, Steven has stopped trying to make his family look like something it isn't, and started letting it be what it actually is, which turns out to be more than sufficient. Rainbow Quartz is one of the most intriguing fusions in the show precisely because of how little screen time she actually has. She appears for a matter of seconds in an extended broadcast cut of the Season 3 episode We Need to Talk, which is an episode told in flashback. Greg recounting to Steven the story of how he won Rose Quartz's genuine attention after a period in which she'd been fascinated by him as a novelty without quite seeing him as a person. The context of Rainbow Quartz's appearance is loaded. Greg had organized a musical performance trying to impress Rose through their shared love of music. Pearl and Rose fused as Rainbow Quartz in the middle of it. Graceful, acrobatic, clearly wonderful, and the implication is hard to miss. Pearl was making a point. There are things between herself and Rose, the fusion says, that you cannot access. There are forms of closeness that aren't yours to have. It's not particularly kind, and the show is honest about that without turning Pearl into a villain for it. It's a recognizable thing. The impulse to demonstrate a closeness you're afraid of losing in the presence of someone you perceive as a threat to it. What we see of Rainbow Quartz in those seconds is limited. Graceful movement, precise footwork, a quality of effortless confidence that doesn't seem to be performing for anyone in particular because it doesn't need to. Her weapon is presumably a parasol, given that Rainbow Quartz 2.0 wields one, and the design logic suggests the weapon form persists as a characteristic of the Pearl-Rose gem combination, regardless of which Rose-analogous gem is involved. A parasol is an interesting weapon, protective, stylish, good for redirecting and deflecting, not primarily destructive. That tracks for both components. We can infer some things about what Rainbow Quartz would be like from knowing Rose and Pearl. Rose Quartz is warm, expansive, curious, genuinely powerful in ways that go beyond the physical. Someone who cared about the earth and its life as a philosophical commitment. Who loved the people around her with real depth but also with specific blind spots. Pearl is precise, devoted, anxious, talented in ways she's often reluctant to acknowledge fully. The combination of Rose's openness and Pearl's careful attention would, one imagines, produce someone quite lovely. Someone who notices things and approaches them with warmth rather than analysis. The emotional weight of Rainbow Quartz comes from knowing how this story ends. Pearl's feelings for Rose were unrequited in the specific and difficult sense of loving someone who cares about you enormously but doesn't love you in the same way, and doesn't quite know how to address that directly. Rose loved Pearl. She wasn't able to give Pearl what Pearl wanted, and for a long time she seems not to have fully understood what Pearl wanted. And that dynamic persisted for thousands of years without resolution. Fusion with Rose was likely, for Pearl, the closest thing to being truly and completely known by her that she could access. That context makes the existence of Rainbow Quartz 2.0. Pearl fusing with Steven, Rose's son, someone who occupies the same gem position Pearl cares about, more resonant than it might otherwise be. Same weapon. Very different feeling. A through line between the two fusions that speaks to Pearl's continued capacity for genuine connection across a very significant change in circumstances. The We Need to Talk episode is also interesting for what it reveals about how Rose related to Pearl's feelings, and how that relationship changed over time. Rose genuinely didn't understand, for a long time, that Pearl was in love with her. Or at least didn't understand the depth of it, or the cost of not acknowledging it. The episode shows Rose learning, through Greg's patient and slightly uncomfortable conversation with her, that being fascinated by someone and genuinely seeing them are different things. That lesson doesn't come from Pearl because Pearl can't give it. She's too close, too invested, too willing to accept whatever she's offered. It comes from Greg, who has a lot less power in the situation but a much clearer view of what's actually happening. Rainbow Quartz in that episode is partly Pearl asserting that power imbalance as firmly as she can. It doesn't work. Rose chooses Greg, and Pearl eventually finds her way to something more genuine with the people around her. But for a moment, Rainbow Quartz was how Pearl said, "There are parts of my life with Rose that will always exist outside your reach," which is, in its own way, true, just not as reassuring as Pearl probably hoped. Stevonnie is the first instance in the show of a human successfully participating in gem fusion. Before Stevonnie, the assumption was that fusion required gem-based beings, that the physical and emotional synchronization involved was something gem-kind had developed, not something a human could do. Steven, being half human and half gem, is the bridge between those two possibilities. They first form in Alone Together, which is a season 1 episode and one of the most widely discussed in the show's run. Steven and Connie are dancing together in the barn, just because they like dancing just for fun, and suddenly, without intending to, they fuse. The result is Stevonnie, tall, beautiful, approximately 16 in apparent age, of indeterminate gender, with Steven's dark curly hair and Connie's general coloring and a blend of their clothing, clearly not quite either of them. Garnet's response to this is one of the episode's most important moments. She tells them that fusion is not about being one person, and not about being two people. It's an experience. She describes Stevonnie as a singular being, invites them to be that just as they are, and leaves them to it. That framing, fusion as experience rather than identity, is central to everything Stevonnie represents. They're not Steven wearing Connie's perspective, and not Connie wearing Steven's abilities. They're a third thing that exists in the space between those two people when both of them are fully and genuinely present with each other. The show is consistent throughout their appearances about treating Stevonnie as their own entity. They have their own reactions, their own sense of things. They don't automatically know everything, either component individually knows. The metaphor layers are multiple and deliberate. The most immediate is something like puberty and the experience of inhabiting a suddenly different body. Stevonnie is taller than either Steven or Connie, more visibly adult presenting. And one of the through lines of Alone Together is the discomfort of being perceived differently than you're used to. People at the dance they attend don't know who Stevonnie is. Some find them attractive in a way that feels overwhelming rather than pleasant. One adult man keeps pressing towards Stevonnie after being clearly signaled to stop. The episode handles this carefully. Stevonnie's discomfort isn't resolved too quickly or brushed aside, and the implicit message that how others perceive your body doesn't create obligations is handled without being didactic about it. The consent dimension runs throughout Stevonnie's appearances. They can only exist when both Steven and Connie are genuinely willing, genuinely comfortable, genuinely present with each other. They break apart when either component is distressed, uncertain, or not fully there. This isn't incidental. It's the metaphor being entirely explicit about what it's saying. A genuine connection requires ongoing willingness from both people. The moment one person is somewhere else mentally or emotionally, the connection can't hold. The show doesn't state this as a lesson, it just shows it. Stevonnie is voiced by A.J. Michalka, who brings exactly the right quality of youthful uncertainty combined with genuine confidence. Someone who is finding their footing in a new experience without being entirely defined by that uncertainty. The voice is distinctive enough to feel like its own thing, rather than a blend of Steven and Connie's voices, which is right. Their appearances in the later seasons are interesting in different ways from the debut. During the Homeworld arc, Steven becomes Stevonnie, apparently partly out of instinct, partly out of the stressful circumstances, and there's a sequence of Stevonnie floating between stars in space that became something of an iconic image from the show's later period. The dreamlike quality of those sequences, combined with the line, "I am not afraid of you," has a resonance that lands outside the immediate plot context. It's something about the particular quality of being a new kind of person and standing in that, without the world fully knowing what to do with you. The show eventually makes the nature of Steven and Connie's relationship explicit. They love each other more than friendship, and Stevonnie was always the visible form of that. The relationship made tangible in the most literal way the show's language allows. When they fuse, it's not a strategy. It's two people who know each other very well and choose freely to be in the same space in the fullest possible sense. The non-binary quality of Stevonnie is handled with the show's characteristic lightness on these things. No announcement, no scene where other characters process it, no explanation required. Stevonnie uses they/them pronouns, looks the way they look, and that's simply how it is. Rebecca Sugar described the character as exploring themes of adolescence and new identity, what it means to be a kind of person that existing categories don't quite contain. And the approach to gender within that is consistent and unforced throughout. One small detail I find worth noting. Stevonnie is nearly always treated by the other characters with straightforward acceptance once the initial surprise passes. Greg, when he meets them, is just delighted and complimentary. The off-colors, when Steven becomes Stevonnie on Homeworld. Take a beat, but don't make a production of it. The show is consistent across its run in treating Stevonnie's existence as remarkable rather than problematic. Something worth being curious about, something to welcome rather than interrogate. The contrast with Homeworld's response to cross-type fusion of any kind is quietly pointed. Stevonnie is one of the more beloved characters in the show's run, which makes sense. They represent something very specific and also very universal. The discovery that two people, together, can be something neither of them is alone, and that thing is worth being, regardless of whether the world has a ready-made category for it. Malachite is the show's darkest fusion, and the show is entirely clear-eyed about why. To understand Malachite properly, you need both of her components in context, and you need a sense of the historical background that produced them. The Gem War, the conflict between Homeworld and the Crystal Gem Rebellion, ended thousands of years before the show's present day. It ended badly for everyone. Rose Quartz and Pearl were saved from the corruption attack that ended the war by Rose's shield, but most gems on Earth were corrupted, driven mad, reduced to monstrous instinct, unable to maintain their gem forms. Gems caught between sides, gems who simply existed on Earth at the wrong moment, became the corrupted gem monsters Steven and the Crystal Gem spend much of the first season capturing and containing in bubbles. The war didn't end cleanly. It ended with casualties that couldn't be fully counted. Lapis Lazuli had been imprisoned in a mirror for thousands of years. Not dormant, aware, and unable to communicate, and watching the world move on without her, while she had no way to reach it. Not dormant, aware, and unable to communicate, and watching the world move on without her while she had no way to reach it. When Steven eventually frees her in the first season, she's exhausted and traumatized and furious at the gems who held her, and uncertain what to do with her own existence now. She just wants to go home. She doesn't get to, immediately, because there's a war in the way. Jasper is a quartz soldier, enormous, powerful, built for combat, convinced of her own superiority with a certainty that functions like faith rather than arrogance. She was made in Earth's kindergarten during the Gem Rebellion, survived the corruption attack at the war's end, and has been deployed by Yellow Diamond as heavy-duty enforcement. She's not unintelligent. She's filtered everything through a framework in which strength is the only real variable, and she is, almost always, the strongest thing in the room. When Jasper proposes fusion during the events of the Season 1 finale, it's a tactical offer. She wants Lapis's hydrokinesis, water control, added to her own considerable capabilities. She frames it as mutually beneficial. She is wrong about what Lapis is going to do with the offer. Lapis agrees. And then, once they're Malachite, she drags Jasper to the bottom of the ocean and holds her there. The line preceding this is one of the most significant in the show's run. I am not going to let you hurt my family. Lapis, who had been a prisoner for thousands of years, who just wanted to leave, uses fusion to imprison someone else and does it explicitly to protect Steven and the crystal gems. It's an act of sacrifice structured as self-destruction. She is strong enough to hold Jasper down. She is not strong enough for it to not cost her enormously. Malachite's visual design reflects the instability of the whole thing. She's centaur-like, Jasper's upper configuration with additional arm legs below, 4 eyes, the orange and white of Jasper blending with Lapis's deep blue into something that doesn't quite resolve into a coherent palette. She looks like something that should not be holding together as well as it is, which is exactly the point. The interior dynamic is shown across several episodes, most directly in Steven's dream sequences. Lapis holds control of the hydrokinesis and uses it as chains. Jasper controls the body when she can rest it. Malachite moves the way Jasper moves in those moments, but can't break free. 2 beings in perpetual struggle for dominance inside a single form, Lapis gradually exhausting herself to maintain the imprisonment. What the show is examining through Malachite is something about the nature of certain toxic dynamics that's more honest than comfortable. Lapis chose to do this. She chose it to protect people she cared about, and she is paying for it in an ongoing, immediate, exhausting way. The prison costs the jailer as much as it costs the prisoner. The person holding someone captive is also held. Jasper's trajectory after Malachite breaks is also worth following because the show doesn't drop it. She becomes obsessed with recreating the fusion, searches for other lapis lazulis, eventually tries to force fusion with a corrupted gem. She describes Malachite as the best she'd ever felt. The experience of being that powerful and combined had done something to her that she couldn't release. This is the show's most explicit treatment of the addiction dimension it introduced with Sugilite, pushed into much darker territory. Jasper wants the feeling back. She doesn't understand or can't accept that what she experienced was Lapis's power deployed against her, not with her. Whatever she felt inside Malachite wasn't the healthy version of what Garnet experiences as Garnet. She's chasing something she's fundamentally misread, and the chasing of it pushes her toward increasingly destructive decisions. The arc resolves in Super Watermelon Island, where Alexandrite's bow delivers the final strike that separates them. Lapis's immediate response is to get as far from everything as possible. She ends up effectively alone on the moon, in an abandoned base, needing a distance that speaks for itself. Her feelings about Jasper, about the fusion, about Earth are complicated across the episodes that follow in ways that don't resolve neatly or quickly. The show respects the length of time that would be needed. One thing the show does with Jasper that I find quite considered: it doesn't make her simply a villain in the Malachite arc. She's wrong about almost everything, about what Malachite was, about what she experienced inside it, about what pursuing further forced fusions will give her. But the wrongness comes from a genuine wound rather than simple malice. Jasper was made on Earth. She's the product of the same kindergarten that made Amethyst, which the show underscores deliberately. She was made during a war, survived the corruption that ended it, and has spent thousands of years filtering everything through a framework in which being stronger than the alternative is the only thing that protects you from destruction. Her obsession with Malachite is part of that framework, expressed in its most self-destructive form. The show doesn't excuse it, it just makes it legible. Malachite is the show being honest about something the rest of the fusion lore approaches more carefully. That you can fuse for very mixed motivations and end up in something genuinely bad for everyone involved. That the power and intimacy of fusion don't protect you from using it in ways that harm. That holding someone prisoner, even when your stated reasons are good, even when they are in fact dangerous, creates its own damage alongside whatever it prevents. Lapis and Jasper's fusion isn't redeemed by the narrative. It's simply over. What comes after it is the long, irregular process of 2 beings figuring out who they are without it. Smoky Quartz arrives in the show at a genuinely low point for both of their components. The episode is Earthlings, in the back half of Season 3, and it's the one where Steven and Amethyst find Jasper on Earth, corrupted and still trying to fight. Both of them are not in a good place, individually. Amethyst has been carrying, for as long as we've known her, a quiet and persistent sense that she is defective. She came out of the kindergarten wrong, too late, too small, not what a quartz soldier was supposed to be. She's managed this mostly through deflection and energy, and refusing to let anyone see it matter to her, with varying degrees of success. Steven has been dealing with the weight of being Rose Quartz's son in a world where Rose's legacy is becoming increasingly complicated, and with the ongoing low-level anxiety about whether his powers will be there when he actually needs them. They've been spending time together across this period of the show, and part of what's drawn them together is exactly this: the specific solidarity of two people who both quietly suspect they might be the least useful member of the team. In that moment facing Jasper, they reach for each other. Not strategically, not because it's the tactically correct move, not because they've assessed the situation and concluded that fusion is the optimal response, because they need each other, and they're willing to say so. Smoky Quartz forms. The personality arrives fully formed and immediately charming in a very specific way. Self-deprecating without being defeated. Not the kind of self-deprecation that's deflecting pain, at least not only that, but the kind where you've been the underdog long enough that you genuinely found something light in it, and that lightness becomes its own kind of strength. They joke about themselves, they don't take the fight too seriously. They are, by all appearances, genuinely enjoying the experience of existing. The yo-yo is the correct weapon for them. It's formed from Steven's shield and Amethyst's whip. The shield compressed into the disc, the whip as the string. And it's unconventional in a way that suits both components. It looks unserious compared to a warhammer or a longbow, and it is also extraordinarily versatile. It can extend to remarkable range. It can be used for grappling and swinging and redirecting in ways that a conventional weapon can't, and Smoky is very good at it. The yo-yo tricks in the show are based on actual Cirque du Soleil techniques from a performer named Tom Black, which explains why they look physically plausible rather than just invented for animation. The Know Your Fusion episode in Season 4 is the more complicated Smoky appearance. Sardonyx decides to host a formal evaluation, setting Smoky against various benchmarks based on the other crystal gem fusions: Opal's precision, Sugilite's strength, Alexandrite's unique fire ability. Smoky fails all of these, which Sardonyx frames with relentless upbeat encouragement that makes each failure feel worse rather than better. And what begins as playful self-deprecation from Smoky slides gradually into something heavier, the real self-doubt that both Steven and Amethyst carry, surfacing through the fusion in a way that's more direct than either of them could have expressed individually. The resolution is one of the better moments in that season. Garnet and Pearl pointing out that the yo-yo does things none of the other fusion weapons can do. Not just the range and versatility, but the specific quality of what it reveals about Steven and Amethyst together. The willingness to be playful, the commitment to finding your own way, rather than arriving pre-optimized. The ability to figure things out by doing them, rather than by being already correct. These aren't defects dressed up as virtues, they're genuine strengths that a different evaluation rubric couldn't recognize. Smoky has one extra arm, two standard ones, and a third branching from the left elbow, and otherwise looks fairly close to human, which is consistent with them being half human. They're the only fusion involving Amethyst that doesn't have long hair. Their hair is short and wild, neither Pearl tidy nor Amethyst long, something that belongs specifically to them. What Smoky Quartz ultimately says is something the show means quite directly. You don't have to be the most powerful or the most precise or the most impressive version of a fusion to be a good one. You have to be real. You have to be willing to reach toward the other person when you need them, and to let them reach toward you. Smoky exists because two people who both felt like they weren't enough decided to stop facing something alone, and what they found in each other turned out to be enough. The Steven and Amethyst dynamic is one of the show's quieter emotional threads, and Smoky Quartz is where it becomes most visible. They bond in part because they're both the youngest, Steven in chronological terms, Amethyst in gem terms, both occupying positions in the crystal gem family where they came after the history had already been made and the roles had already been assigned. Both of them are sometimes compared, implicitly or explicitly, to someone or something they're not. Steven to Rose, Amethyst to the quartz soldier she was supposed to be. Both of them have developed a particular kind of self-deprecating resilience as a response to that. The cheerful refusal to admit the comparison hurts. Smoky is what happens when neither of them has to do that anymore. The self-deprecation remains, it's genuinely part of their personality, but it's held lightly rather than defensively. The show makes a distinction between humor as armor and humor as genuine lightness, and Smoky Quartz, at their best, is the latter. They're not joking about themselves because it's better than crying about themselves. They're joking because they've actually found something to be light about in each other. Now, talking a bit about what fusion looks like on the other side of the Homeworld divide. Because a lot of what makes the crystal gem fusions hit the way they do is the context of what fusion usually means in the world they come from. On Homeworld, same type fusion is entirely normal, functional, unremarkable, a matter of practical arrangement. Two rubies can combine into a stronger ruby for a difficult task. Two jades can merge when the work requires more than one jade's capacity. These fusions are treated straightforwardly as tools, temporary configurations, not beings in their own right, not entities worthy of individual consideration beyond their utility. The result of two topazes fusing is just a more capable topaz, and it will unfuse when the job is done and nothing more is made of it. The Ruby Squad quintuple fusion, all 5 members combining, is a good illustration of this dynamic in the most chaotic possible version. All 5 rubies, the ones the show names Doc, Eyeball, Leggy, Army, and Navy, are so completely united in their purpose at a given moment that they fuse somewhat spontaneously, producing something enormous and enthusiastic and not particularly strategic. The collective intelligence of 5 rubies combined turns out to be roughly what you'd expect from 5 rubies combined. Sincere, loyal, incredibly committed to the current objective, and not encumbered by excessive flexibility of thought. It's funny, but it also illustrates clearly what fusion looks like when it's driven purely by shared single-mindedness, rather than anything like relationship. Technically, impressive in scale, quite limited in depth. The Topaz twins are more troubling than comedic. They appear in the season 4 to 5 arc involving the kidnapped humans, and their role is quite literally to serve as living prisons. They fuse with human captives held inside them, trapping people within the fold of the combined form. It's deeply uncomfortable. The Topazes themselves don't seem particularly troubled by this. They're doing their job. The fusion is a tool. The fact that living beings are enclosed within it doesn't register as a moral consideration worth weighing, because Homeworld hasn't built a framework in which it would. They're not cruel in an active sense. They're simply operating within a system that doesn't make space for the question. Lemon Jade appears even more briefly, just enough to establish that corporate functional gem fusions are the background noise of Homeworld's operation. 2 jades, fused for an assignment. Professional in the sense of being entirely absorbed in the task at hand. It's the most ordinary version of fusion the show depicts, and its ordinariness is the point. What same type fusion looks like in practice? The Lemon Jades and the functional Topaz pairs and the Ruby groupings that happen on Homeworld without ceremony tells you something important about how Homeworld has structured its relationship with the concept. Fusion is fine as long as it's impersonal. Fusion is fine as long as it doesn't mean anything. 2 gems of the same type combining to do a job more effectively is no different from a tool being upgraded. The resulting configuration doesn't have a name that matters, doesn't have a continuous identity between deployments, doesn't accumulate a personality or preferences or the kind of history that would make it complicated to unfuse. It's just a more efficient arrangement of available resources. This is why the crystal gems and eventually the diamonds themselves, by the end of the series, represent such a profound challenge to Homeworld structure. The challenge isn't military, it's conceptual. Cross-type fusion says, these are people, not tools. And once you've said that, it's hard to unsay. And then there's keeping it together. The episode comes in season 2, when Steven and Garnet discover what's beneath one of the kindergartens. What they find are gem shards, broken fragments of shattered gems fuse together against their will in crude and disturbing configurations. Still partially conscious, still trying to move. Small and strange and wrong in a way that's difficult to look at directly. Little collections of beings who had no say in what happened to them and cannot stop it now. Garnet's reaction is one of the more quietly devastating moments in the entire show. She holds it together in front of Steven, because she always holds it together in front of Steven, but you can see it in her. The specific, particular horror of a being whose entire existence is consensual and joyful fusion. Looking at what fusion becomes when the consent and joy are stripped out and replaced with force. She nearly diffuses from the shock. She doesn't, but it costs her. This is the beginning of a thread that leads to the cluster, the ultimate forced fusion, thousands of gem shards buried deep in the Earth's mantle, programmed to form a planet-destroying weapon. These were gems shattered during the Gem War, soldiers, civilians, beings who simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong time, and their fragments were combined into a weapon as a kind of posthumous redeployment. The show asks you to sit with what that means. These were people once, they're now a weapon. The decision to make them into this was deliberate, which means someone thought about it and chose it. The cluster's eventual resolution, Steven managing to communicate with it, to reach the distress underneath the programming, to help the fragments find something like peace by bubbling themselves, is the show's answer to that question to the extent it has one. You can't undo what was done to them. You can try to hear the beings affected by it and respond with something other than further instrumentalization. There's a detail in how this resolution works that's worth pausing on. Steven doesn't destroy the cluster or neutralize it through force. He communicates with it. He extends the same empathic connection he uses with corrupted gems throughout the series, the ability to reach past the distress and the monstrousness to whatever is underneath. And he finds something. Consciousness, suffering, the fragments still trying to be themselves even in the context of being forced into something none of them chose. He offers them a way to exist without merging, and they take it. The cluster bubbles itself. This is the show's small, quiet argument, that even the most thoroughly violated and instrumentalized beings retain something that deserves to be addressed as real. The forced fusions aren't just tragic histories, they're ongoing experiences, still happening, still mattering. And the appropriate response to that isn't destruction or neutralization, but the attempt to actually hear what's there. The forced fusions and same-type fusions collectively do important structural work in the show. They establish what fusion is not. Not a tool, not a temporary configuration, not something you do to someone, not something divorced from the relationship of the beings involved. The crystal gem fusions, even the difficult ones, even Malachite, are what they are in direct contrast to what fusion looks like when it's stripped of everything that makes it meaningful. The off-colors appear in Season 5, during the arc where Steven and Lars end up stranded on Homeworld. They're a group of gems hiding in an abandoned underground kindergarten, surviving by staying out of sight. They're called off-colors because none of them meet Homeworld's ideal specifications, and for the fusions in the group, the specific disqualification is that they're cross-type fusions of exactly the kind Homeworld considers wrong and punishable. Rhodonite is a fusion of a ruby and a pearl, which should already be familiar as a combination that would get you into trouble on Homeworld, given what we know about Garnet's origins. Both gems were owned by a Morganite, serving as her soldier and her personal attendant respectively. They were fond of each other, close in the way that people who work alongside each other constantly sometimes become. They fused once. Morganite discovered it immediately and replaced them both without hesitation. And so, here they are, no longer owned by anyone, no longer of use to Homeworld, hiding underground and trying not to be found. She's small, roughly in the size range of Garnet's earliest form, and she's extremely anxious, constantly, immediately. The anxiety is a permanent feature of how she moves through the world, and it's completely understandable given that her entire existence is technically punishable on the planet she's living on, and she's been hunted by automated systems whose only purpose is to locate her and destroy her. Rhodonite's worst case scenario thinking is not a personality quirk she picked up somewhere. It's a rational response to her circumstances, and the show is careful about this. It sympathizes with her without playing the anxiety for laughs at her expense. She's also, when she's comfortable enough, quite warm and perceptive and genuinely engaged with the world around her. She takes a kind of protective interest in Padparedsha, an off-color sapphire who can only see slightly in the past rather than the future, perpetually announcing things that have just happened with complete conviction. Padparedsha requires gentle management, and Rhodonite provides it with patient affection. She's curious about Steven when she first meets him, guarded, and then slowly warmer, as he demonstrates that he's not going to turn them in. What Rhodonite says in the context of the show's larger conversation about fusion is specific and necessary. That fusing can be an act of survival. Not only physical survival, staying hidden, being harder to find, but the survival of who you are. Her ruby and her pearl chose to be Rhodonite because being Rhodonite is who they want to be. Homeworld said they were wrong to want that. They chose it anyway, at real cost, and have continued choosing it every day since. There's a quiet stubbornness in that which the show clearly respects. Fluorite is the most complex fusion in the show in terms of components. 6 gems combined, none of them named or shown individually in the canon. She's enormous, much larger than you'd expect from the arithmetic of her components. Though interestingly, she's smaller than Obsidian, which is a 5-gem fusion. The size relationship between fusion count and physical scale is clearly not linear, which implies that the nature of the relationship between components matters as much as the number of them. She moves slowly and speaks slowly, and the slow speech pattern is clearly a character trait rather than a limitation. 6 perspectives, processing into a single voice would, one imagines, produce something considered and deliberate. Fluorite speaks as someone who is genuinely taking time with what she says, not because she's unable to go faster, but because going slower is what she does. She's been fused for a long time, probably, and she has the patience that very long fusion seems to produce. Rebecca Sugar confirmed in an interview that the production team knows exactly which 6 gems make up Fluorite. Those components have never been revealed in the show's canon, and at this point it seems like they won't be. The choice is an interesting one. Fluorite gets to be Fluorite, entirely and completely herself, without the audience perpetually trying to assign her qualities to constituent parts. She exists most fully as an integrated entity rather than a sum. Of all the fusions in the show, she's perhaps the one where the argument that the fusion is more real than the components feels most applicable. The Rudel twins are worth a brief note here, even though they're technically not a fusion. They're a single gem who emerged from the kindergarten as conjoined twins, one gemstone producing 2 bodies that cannot be separated. Homeworld categorizes them alongside the forbidden fusions. Something wrong? Something that should have been shattered on discovery? Something that doesn't fit. The show places them within the off-colors group deliberately. The rules Homeworld uses to exclude them are different, but the experience of exclusion is the same. The found family aspect of the off-colors is one of the show's quieter successes. They didn't choose each other in the sense of seeking each other out. They ended up in the same underground kindergarten because all of them were trying to survive, and survival was easier in company than alone. But they've become something genuine over time. When Lars arrives, a fully human teenager who has no business being anywhere near a Homeworld kindergarten, they accept him, and he becomes their captain. Lars' relationship with the off-colors is probably his best story in the whole run, finding people who needed something specific from him, and discovering he could provide it. They eventually make it to Earth, attend Little Homeschool during the future series, and then return to space as Lars' crew on the Sun Incinerator. Rhodonite graduates from Little Homeschool. Fluorite remains calm throughout. It's a good ending for characters who, not long before it, were hiding underground from automated systems trying to destroy them for the crime of existing. One last note on Fluorite's speech that I keep coming back to. The show presents her slow, deliberate delivery as entirely natural, never as a punchline or a limitation. Other characters wait for her to finish. They listen. When she says something, it lands with the weight of someone who chose those particular words because they were the right ones, not because they were the first ones. There's something in that about what very long, very settled fusion might actually feel like from the inside. 6 perspectives that have been in conversation with each other for long enough that speaking requires genuine synthesis. Not just the first response that surfaces. She's been fused for a long time. She knows what she is. And she's at peace with it in a way that the newer, more anxious fusions, Rhodonite, Malachite, even Garnet in her early days, are still working toward. There's a version of Fluorite's arc that the show doesn't dramatize because it doesn't need to. The very long, very quiet process of becoming entirely comfortable with being the thing you are. The fusions Steven forms with each crystal gem in Change Your Mind, and the episodes that follow form a kind of secondary portrait. Each one says something specific about who Steven is to that person, what he brings out in them, what they find together, that neither of them is alone. Rainbow Quartz 2.0 is the fusion of Steven and Pearl, and they're arguably the most immediately distinctive of this set. The design brief, as described by writer-director Colin Howard, was Mary Poppins meets Dick Van Dyke, which is a very specific brief that the animation team executed faithfully. Rainbow Quartz 2.0 has precise footwork, impeccable posture, and moves as though the choreography for everything they do was decided in advance, and they're simply executing it with pleasant confidence. They're the kind of person who makes looking after things seem effortless, not because it is, but because they've simply decided that's the register they operate in. They use he/him, and they /them pronouns, confirmed by Rebecca Sugar and Colin Howard in interviews. The show handles this with its characteristic matter-of-fact approach. No explanation required, no scene where other characters have to process it, just a character who is who they are. The parasol is the weapon. It fires energy beams from the tip. It can be used for deflecting, redirecting, and generally repositioning problems rather than destroying them. It's protective by nature rather than offensive, which fits both Pearl's instinct to guard the people she cares about and Steven's aversion to purely destructive responses. As a weapon, it looks absurd and functions precisely, which is exactly the right combination for this character. The episode that really establishes Rainbow Quartz 2.0's personality in a relaxed context involves Steven and Pearl accidentally booking conflicting obligations on the same day. Pearl promised Rainbow Quartz 2.0 would spend time with Onion. Steven has a home safety seminar scheduled as Sunstone with Garnet. The solution is to keep switching between the two fusions throughout the day, which creates the comic premise of Rainbow Quartz 2.0 having to constantly unfuse and refuse, while Onion becomes increasingly chaotic in their absence. What emerges from this is specific. Onion responds to Rainbow Quartz 2.0 in a way he simply doesn't respond to Pearl alone. Pearl cannot keep his attention the way Rainbow does, and when they're separated, the resulting chaos is immediate and enthusiastic. There's something in Rainbow Quartz 2.0's particular quality, the unhurried patience, the genuine presence, the capacity to be fully engaged with whatever is directly in front of them, that neither Pearl nor Steven produces independently. Pearl's anxiety, filtered through Steven's warmth, becomes steadier. Steven's warmth, given Pearl's focused precision, becomes more intentional. What they produce together is a caretaker, someone who makes you feel genuinely looked after, without it feeling like a transaction, without it feeling like an obligation. Patient without being passive, engaged without being urgent. The kind of person who, when they're with you, is actually with you. There's a particular quality to the Steven and Pearl relationship across the show that Rainbow Quartz 2.0 crystallizes. Pearl cared about Steven's mother in a way that was complicated and not always healthy, and some of that complicated history initially complicated her relationship with Steven himself. She could project, sometimes, or find the reminder painful. But across the series, they develop something that's genuinely theirs. Pearl teaches Steven, protects Steven, is willing to be honest with Steven in ways she sometimes struggled to be honest with Rose. Steven accepts Pearl as she is, offers her the patient understanding she sometimes couldn't offer herself, and doesn't need her to be anything other than who she is. Rainbow Quartz 2.0 is that relationship made physical. The fusion that Pearl and Steven produce is warm and competent and unhurried and genuinely prescient with whoever needs them, which is a very good description of what Pearl and Steven are at their best together. It also carries the parasol, which connects back to the original Rainbow Quartz through the design language of the gem combination, and in doing so quietly acknowledges that Pearl's capacity for genuine care and connection has persisted through everything. Through thousands of years of a complicated relationship with Rose, through the loss of that relationship, and through the gradual process of learning that she can build something real with the people who remain. Sunstone forms in the same change your mind sequence as Rainbow Quartz 2.0. And if Rainbow Quartz 2.0 is the patient, attentive caretaker, Sunstone is the enthusiastic one. The one who really, really wants everyone to be okay and has opinions about it. The design is striking in a specific way. Top heavy, with 2 enormous primary arms and 2 significantly smaller secondary arms, a starburst radiating hair configuration that suggests heat shimmer, and a visor. The overall silhouette is somehow both imposing and approachable, which is either a contradiction or precisely what you'd get from combining Garnet's authority with Steven's warmth. I'd argue it's the latter. The weapons are suction cups. Knee pads with suction cups that can be worn as gauntlets, used to climb surfaces, redirect impacts, and generally be very helpful in a practical way. This is, objectively, the most unexpected weapon choice in a show that has already introduced a yo-yo and a parasol as primary fusion weapons. The show is completely aware of how this reads and commits to it entirely. Sunstone is not embarrassed by the suction cups. Sunstone is enthusiastic about the suction cups. Sunstone would like to discuss with you the many practical applications of the suction cups. What the suction cups represent underneath the comedy is something consistent with the character. They are defensive and adaptive, good for connection and redirection rather than pure force. Garnet's gauntlets, built for impact, become suction cups when filtered through Steven's instinct to protect rather than to strike. It's the show's way of suggesting something about what happens when combat capability is shaped by care. It doesn't disappear, it just changes form. Sunstone's personality leans heavily into public safety PSA energy. They're enthusiastic, they have quite a lot of information. They want to ensure you have the relevant safety protocols. There's something genuinely funny about this being what Steven and Garnet produce together. Garnet's quiet authority and Steven's earnest desire for everyone to be okay combining into something that would absolutely produce a series of home safety videos and be very invested in the content. The emotional undertone, as with all the Steven component fusions, is about what this particular bond looks like made visible. Garnet's steadiness gives Steven grounding he sometimes needs. Steven's warmth gives Garnet's authority a quality of approachability it doesn't always have individually. Sunstone is that dynamic expressed. Not Garnet's calm alone, not Steven's earnestness alone, but both of them together, adding up to something that is deeply, practically invested in making sure things go well for everyone. Garnet and Steven's relationship across the show is one the show doesn't dramatize as much as some of the other Crystal Gem bonds, but it's there consistently in the background. Garnet was there when Steven was born. She was the first person outside the immediate family to hold him, in a sense. She was leading the Crystal Gems when he arrived. She took on the responsibility of helping to raise him alongside Pearl and Amethyst in the aftermath of Rose's choice to give birth rather than remain. She leads in ways that involve a lot of trusting Steven's instincts even when she doesn't share them, which is its own form of respect. And Steven, for his part, has a particular kind of trust in Garnet that's different from his relationships with Pearl and Amethyst. With Pearl, there's warmth but also occasional tension around Pearl's protectiveness. With Amethyst, there's sibling-level ribbing and genuine affection. With Garnet, there's a quality of simple trust. She is who she says she is, she means what she says, and she will be steady in ways that the situation sometimes requires someone to be steady. Sunstone is the natural product of two people who trust each other in exactly that uncomplicated way. Obsidian is, in some ways, the most layered fusion in the show, because she exists in two distinct versions separated by thousands of years of history, and the difference between those versions says something quite specific about what the crystal gems are now compared to what they were. Start with the historical form, and start with a detail that's been in every single establishing shot of the show from episode 1 without most viewers registering it consciously. The Crystal Temple, the structure the crystal gems have lived in throughout the entire series, the building shaped like a giant humanoid figure, is modeled on obsidian. The statue forming the temple's outline has multiple arms, some broken or damaged over the millennia, with gemstone positions that correspond to the original crystal gem components. Pearl on the forehead, amethyst on the chest, ruby and sapphire on the palms, and rose quartz at the navel, which is also the entrance to the beach house. The home they've lived in for thousands of years is built in the image of their greatest combined form. The show almost never comments on this directly. It's just the shape of where they live. The implication that obsidian was significant enough that the crystal gems built a home in her image, that this combined form was important enough to commemorate in the structure of their dwelling, is left entirely for the viewer to arrive at. The historical obsidian appears in historical friction via theatrical reenactment. Rose quartz, ruby, sapphire, pearl, and amethyst combined to protect the early human inhabitants of what would become Beach City, specifically the ancestors of the Dewey family, from a large gem threat in the very early period of the crystal gem's presence on Earth. This obsidian is enormous, ancient feeling, with the many arms that the temple depicts, looking like exactly what a 5,000-year-old legend about a many-armed giant protecting the coast should look like. She's the crystal gems at their most unified, fighting for something that genuinely mattered to all of them. The current obsidian, Steven's version, forms in the Change Your Mind sequence. The differences from the historical form are subtle. Rose's gem at the navel is now Steven's star. The coloring shifts slightly. Something in the way she moves carries traces of Steven's particular quality. But she's recognizably the same fusion, the same 5 positions filled. The weapon is one of the most physically impressive in the show. All their weapons combine into the hilt of a giant sword, from which a blade of magma is drawn and extended. It's a weapon that only exists because all 5 of them are present. Pearl's spear contributes precision. Amethyst's whip contributes flexibility. Garnet's gauntlets contribute force. Steven's shield contributes the capacity to protect as well as strike. The sword is what all of those things become when they're held together. Not a simple combination, but something that emerges from the combination. Obsidian also has what appears to be a mask on her face, which turns out to be a second face. When it opens, and it opens to reveal a second fiery maw, there's something genuinely ancient and powerful about it, like looking at something that existed before the current world and will outlast it. The scale of Obsidian's visual presence is different from the other crystal gem fusions. She's not just large, she's imposing in a way that suggests deep time. What the current Obsidian says about Steven and his place in the crystal gems is something the show has been building toward since the first episode. He belongs here. Not as Rose's replacement or Rose's continuation. The show is careful and clear about Steven not being Rose, but as himself, the person who was born into this group of gems and became someone in his own right within it. When Steven takes Rose's position in Obsidian, the fusion works. It works because he belongs there. The new Obsidian is different from the historical one. She's not better or worse. She's the crystal gems of the present, shaped by everything that's happened since the rebellion. Still the same commitment to the same things, but held by different hands now. One thing the current Obsidian makes visible that the historical version couldn't. The crystal gems have changed. They're not the same group that built the temple, not simply because Rose is absent, but because of everything that's happened in the intervening thousands of years. Pearl has been rebuilding her sense of self independent of any single person she's defined herself by. Amethyst has gradually come to terms with what she is rather than what she was supposed to be. Garnet has been leading, and building, and choosing Garnet every day across millennia. And Steven has arrived, the person who connects this group to the human world and to their own capacity for change in a way that Rose, for all her warmth, was not always able to provide. When the new Obsidian forms, she's the product of all of that. Rose's place in the fusion is now Steven's, not because Steven is Rose, the show is quite direct that he isn't and shouldn't try to be, but because Steven belongs in this family in his own right, as himself. The fusion that results is different, it belongs to different people now. And the show's argument is that this is not a loss. There's something worth sitting with in the image of the Crystal Temple. The gem the show's main character lives in is a monument to what the crystal gems are when they're entirely together. It's been there the whole time. The show just let it be there, visible and unremarked until you were ready to see it. Mega Pearl appears in Steven Universe, Future, the epilogue series, and her existence requires understanding a piece of backstory that Future begins to fill in more completely. There was another Pearl before the Pearl we know. Pink Diamond's original Pearl, referred to informally as volleyball, in the show. A name that comes from a game she plays early in an episode and which serves to sidestep the awkward problem of two characters who are both just called Pearl. Served Pink Diamond on Homeworld, and in her early Earth installation before things took the turn they took. Pink Pearl has a visible crack across one side of her face, a scar given to her by White Diamond as punishment for Pink Diamond's behavior. When Pink Diamond staged her own shattering and became Rose Quartz, Pink Pearl was transferred to White Diamond's service and left with that mark, both physically and otherwise. Our Pearl, the Pearl we've known since the beginning, came later. She's the Pearl who chose, with Pink Diamond, to commit to the Crystal Gem Rebellion. She's the Pearl who chose independence and identity and the long project of becoming someone defined by her own choices rather than her owners. She doesn't carry a visible crack. What she carries is more internal, the perfectionism, the need for external validation that she's slowly been learning to find within herself, the ongoing work of knowing who she is. Both of them were shaped profoundly by serving Pink Diamond. Both carry the weight of that relationship. The experiences were different. Our Pearl got to choose to leave. Volleyball's transition was not her choice, and the effects are expressed differently. But the root is the same. They were both Pink Diamond's Pearl at different times, and both of them have been living with what that means. When they fuse as Mega Pearl, it's an act of healing in a very specific sense. They each know something the other experienced from the inside. They each lived through a version of the same relationship. And in the fusion, they can offer each other something no one else can. Recognition without explanation. Genuine understanding that doesn't require the whole story to be told, because the other person was there, in a different way, and knows. What Mega Pearl looks like is a blend of both designs, naturally. Pink and white elements combined, both gemstone positions visible. Something that reads as both of them and as clearly neither of them individually. She's voiced by Dee Dee Magno Hall, our Pearl's voice actress, which keeps something of the familiar Pearl quality while allowing the character to feel different in cadence. The arc she represents is one Future handles well, healing through acknowledgement, not through erasing what happened, not through tidy resolution, but through finding someone who doesn't look away from what you've been through, who actually knew what it was in their own version, and letting that be the beginning of something. Mega Pearl is what that looks like in the show's visual language. Two pearls, shaped by the same source in different ways, choosing to be in the same space and finding, in that shared space, something like peace. One of the things Future does that the main series couldn't quite do, because the main series needed to keep certain things in the background, is examine the specific shape of Pink Diamond's impact on the people around her. Pink Diamond was not a simple character, and the show doesn't present her as one. She caused harm through her own genuine distress and inability to exist within the system she was born into, and some of that harm fell on the Pearls who served her in ways that were different and similarly significant. The show is careful not to reduce either Pearl to simply a victim, Both of them made choices. Both of them had agency within their constrained circumstances. Both of them have been doing the work of figuring out who they are apart from that history. When they fuse, they bring all of that to the fusion. And what the fusion produces is, in some sense, a witness. A being who has access to both stories simultaneously and can hold them together without needing to prioritize one version as more real or more deserving than the other. That's what healing sometimes looks like. Not resolution, not forgetting. Just the experience of being genuinely known by someone who doesn't need you to explain. Steg appears in Steven Universe, the movie, the 2019 musical film set after the conclusion of the main series, and he's here for a relatively short time. But the fact that he exists at all is quietly significant, and the show knows it. Greg Universe is fully human. No gem component, no magical abilities, no particular connection to the mechanics of gem fusion. He's a retired van-dwelling former rock musician who has become, by the time of the movie, the single most famous recording artist on Earth through entirely normal channels, which is its own story. He is also, by any reasonable measure, a genuinely good father, one who has navigated the genuinely unusual experience of raising a half-gem child largely without a manual and done better than he had any right to expect. The question Steg's existence raises is whether fusion between a non-gem human and a half-gem is even theoretically possible. We established that Steven can fuse with humans through the human half of his nature. Stevonnie demonstrated that, but Connie has no gem component at all, and even Stevonnie was born of a connection between a half-gem and a person who had trained alongside gems for years. Greg has no training, no gem sensitivity, no reason to be able to do this. The logic of fusion as the show has established it doesn't obviously accommodate him. Steg forms anyway, during the film's climactic sequence, and the logic is the same as it always is in this show, the relationship. Greg and Steven's bond, a father and son who have been through genuinely unusual things together, who never quite had a conventional family unit, but made something real and warm from what they had, is sufficient. That understanding, that genuine mutual knowing is enough. Steg is a fusion of two musicians. Greg's guitar and stage presence have been a constant in the show from the first season, and Steven has musical ability threaded throughout his story, and he looks the part. 4 arms, 2 extra for instrument playing capacity, a quality of rock and roll warmth. He's voiced by Ted Leo, a musician, maintaining the show's casting pattern perfectly. Ted Leo's voice sits somewhere between Greg's rough warmth and Steven's earnestness and lands at something that sounds like it belongs at a small, intimate concert where everyone in the room is genuinely happy to be there. Steg's appearance is brief, but what it says is clear. Steven's humanness is not a complicating factor or a limitation. It's part of who he is, and it's real enough to allow him to fuse with the person who gave him that humanness. Greg, for his part, seems genuinely delighted by the whole experience. This is entirely in character for Greg Universe, who has approached nearly every unusual thing his life has produced with a quality of straightforward warmth that is probably his best feature. There's a quiet argument in Steg's existence that the show has been making since the beginning, but which only becomes fully visible here. Steven has spent a lot of the series navigating his dual nature. The gem half that comes with powers and history, and the weight of being Rose Quartz's son, and the human half that comes with feelings and mortality and a father who lives in a van. The gem half gets most of the narrative attention, because that's where the plot lives. But the human half is equally real, and in certain ways more important to who Steven is. His empathy, his capacity for genuine connection with people, his instinct to care about beings even when they're considered enemies. Steg is the human half of Steven's nature expressing itself as fusion. Not the gem doing something impossible, but the person. The Greg Universe's son part. The Beach City kid part. The half that learned everything it knows about love from watching his dad treat his mother's memory with gentleness. Finding someone he trusts completely and becoming something together with them. Steg doesn't demonstrate that Steven has overcome his human limitations. He demonstrates that the human part of Steven isn't a limitation at all. It's the thing that makes him capable of this particular form of wonder. Bluebird Azurite appears in Steven Universe, Future, and she stands as the clearest counterpoint to almost everything else discussed tonight. Her components, briefly. Aquamarine is small, blue, winged, and deeply unpleasant in a very efficient way. The kind of cruelty that comes from never having operated in a context where it had consequences. She was previously tasked with kidnapping humans for Yellow Diamond, which she carried out with cheerful thoroughness, specifically targeting people Steven cared about. She told him, at one point, that she found him pathetic. She did not mean this as a joke. Eyeball, the name the crystal gems gave to the ruby they encountered in space, referring to the placement of her gemstone, is the ruby who stabbed Steven while they were adrift in space during Season 4. She was genuinely convinced Steven was responsible for Rose Quartz's crimes against Homeworld, and attempted to shatter him. She was bubbled. She eventually got loose. She has maintained her grievance with consistency. Both of them have specific personal reasons to resent Steven. Both of them encountered him, were defeated or embarrassed by the encounter, and have not released that. At some point, the show doesn't dramatize the conversation that led to this. They found each other and decided their shared resentment was sufficient foundation to fuse on. Bluebird Azurite is what that produces. A fusion that looks cheerful in the same way Aquamarine looks cheerful, which is to say in a way where something is slightly wrong in the register. The design leans into a deceptive pleasantness. She doesn't look threatening the way Sugilite looks threatening. Doesn't look wrong the way Malachite looks wrong. She seems fine. She seems like she might be fine. She isn't. She arrives presenting herself as someone who wants to reconnect positively with the crystal gems, and it takes longer than it probably should for everyone to realize the problem. The eventual exposure is not particularly dramatic. Future has a lot happening, and she's defeated by Alexandrite, which is a satisfying detail. The crystal gems' fully combined form, built on thousands of years of genuine relationship, defeating a fusion built entirely from shared hatred of one person. What Bluebird says about fusion is the cleanest statement of something the show has been circling since Malachite. You can fuse on anything. You can fuse on rage, on shared resentment, on the utility of combined power, on the simple fact that you're both against the same person. The fusion will form, but what you build it on shows in the result. Bluebird doesn't quite cohere. She doesn't produce something genuine, something that exists in its own right the way Garnet or even Opal does. She's a strategic alliance given physical form, and the strategic alliance is based on what both parties are against rather than what either of them is for. The crystal gem fusions, for all their complexity and occasional dysfunction, are consistently built on something the people inside them are for the relationship, for the other person, for something that matters to them. That foundation is the difference, and Bluebird is the show's starkest demonstration of why it matters. There's also something to notice about what Bluebird reveals about the individual components. Aquamarine, alone, is calculating and self-interested and has a very high opinion of her own capability. Eyeball, alone, is driven and convinced of her righteousness. Neither of them is particularly oriented toward anyone else's well-being. When they fuse, those qualities combine and amplify rather than balancing each other. Both of them are in the fusion for what it gives them, not for the other person. And a fusion where both parties are primarily there for what they get out of it rather than what they give to it is always going to have a quality of instability underneath whatever surface it presents. Bluebird looks fine, Bluebird is not fine. And the crystal gems, who know what genuine fusion actually looks like, eventually notice. Since we're being thorough tonight, it's worth spending some time with the fusions that don't get long character arcs, but are part of the show's landscape nonetheless. The background fusions, the ones that appear briefly, do what they do, and leave without much ceremony. They're interesting precisely because of their ordinariness, because the show uses them to fill in what the world looks like around the crystal gems and the off-colors. The vast middle ground of fusion that isn't about love or trauma or survival, but is simply quietly part of how things work. Lemon Jade appears during the Homeworld arc. Two Jades fuse together, doing what the show implies Jades do in the general course of their existence. administrative work, support functions. The kind of quiet, competent management that keeps a civilization's bureaucratic machinery moving. They're professional in the sense of being entirely absorbed in their current task, not particularly warm or cold, simply present and capable. Two of the same gem type fused for function rather than feeling. It's a fine existence, probably. The show doesn't linger on them because there's nothing particularly wrong with them, and nothing particularly remarkable either. They're the background hum of Homeworld's fusion culture, the version that generates no controversy because it's never about anything personal. There's something useful about Lemon Jade for understanding the show's world, though. She's evidence that fusion is genuinely normal on Homeworld in certain contexts, that the taboo is specific, about cross-type fusion and what it implies about individual gems choosing each other, rather than about fusion itself as a practice. Homeworld is an anti-fusion. Homeworld is anti the meaning of fusion. The distinction matters when you're thinking about what the show is actually critiquing. Watermelon tourmaline is canonical but barely glimpsed. Two tourmalines combined, existing in the show's peripheral landscape. There isn't much to say about them, because the show doesn't give us much to work with. They exist. They are presumably fine. Moving on is the appropriate response, which is itself a kind of small point. Not every fusion needs a story. The Ruby quintuple fusion, all 5 members of the Ruby squad combining, is worth a bit more attention, because the Rubies themselves are characterized with genuine affection by the show, and their combined form reflects that. The squad members, as named by the crystal gems for their distinguishing features, Doc, the de facto leader, who speaks with authority and usually has an opinion ready. Eyeball, the one with the off-center gemstone, who has strong views about Rose Quartz and a long memory for grievances. Leggy, the youngest, still getting used to being anywhere at all, perpetually slightly bewildered in an endearing way. Disarmy, the enthusiastic one, very committed, possibly the most straightforwardly Ruby of all the Rubies, and Navy, who turns out to be considerably more calculating than the others give her credit for, which catches the crystal gems off guard at least once. 5 distinct personalities, each one a variation on the Ruby theme of passionate single-mindedness and impulsive conviction. When they fuse all together, what you get is all 5 of those single-mindednesses combined and pointing in the same direction simultaneously, with a predictable result of producing something enormous and very, very focused on the current objective. Strategic flexibility is not the quintuple fusion's strong suit. Commitment is. The combination reads as the purest possible expression of what rubies are. Pure, loyal purposefulness scaled to roughly the size of a small building. It's funny, and warmly so. The rubies are one of the show's more consistently affectionate character concepts. Beings who are not particularly complex but are extremely sincere, who operate with complete conviction and genuine care for each other within the specific bonds they form. Their fusion is a natural extension of that. 5 rubies who really mean it, combined. Now, talking a bit about something Rebecca Sugar mentioned in a podcast interview that I find genuinely interesting as a piece of fusion lore. She noted that gems with the same names as the show's cross-type fusions exist on Homeworld as individual gem types. There are garnets on Homeworld, individual gems, natural single garnets, not fusions. There are opals. There are probably Alexandrites. These are just gem types that happen to share names with the cross-type fusions we know from the show. When our Garnet chose her name, she chose it knowing that individual garnets existed. She had presumably encountered them. Gemkind often names themselves after types they've encountered or admired. She chose the name of a real gem type, making it feel selected and intentional rather than simply assigned. There's something quietly lovely about that. Ruby and Sapphire's fusion, choosing a name that exists in the world already, claiming a category for themselves, existing alongside the other garnets as a different kind of the same thing. This detail also gestures toward a dimension of the show's world that isn't explored in great detail but is implied throughout. the sheer breadth of gem types and combinations that exist across the universe. The fusions we've talked about tonight are the ones with names and personalities and screen time. But if Homeworld has been operating for millions of years, combining and deploying gems in same type configurations across countless colonies, the number of fusions that exist in that world, ordinary, functional, unnamed by anyone who ever saw them, must be staggering. The crystal gem fusions are extraordinary within that world. Not because fusion itself is extraordinary, but because of what they chose to mean by it. Fluorite's unnamed components deserve a final note here as we wrap up this section. Rebecca Sugar has confirmed that the production team knows exactly which 6 gems make up fluorite. Those components have never been revealed in the canon, and the choice feels increasingly deliberate the more I think about it. Fluorite gets to be fluorite, completely without the audience perpetually trying to allocate her qualities to constituent parts, without every characteristic she displays being mapped back to a root cause. She exists most fully as an integrated entity. The fusion is more real than the sum of what made it. This connects to something the show does throughout its run with naming in general. The crystal gems all have names: Garnet, Amethyst, Pearl, that are gem types rather than individual identifiers. Because gems on Homeworld don't typically have individual names the way humans do. They're named for what they are, not who they are. The crystal gems have, variously, claimed those type names as personal ones, which is itself a kind of statement. I am not just an instance of a category. I am a specific person who happens to share a name with a category, and the name belongs to me as much as to the type. Garnet chose her name knowing individual Garnets existed. She looked at the world, found a word that felt right, and took it as her own. That choice is, in miniature, everything the show says about fusion. You can become something new and name it yourself. And the name is real and the thing it names is real, regardless of whether the world around you has built a category for it yet. There's a case to be made that this is the show's deepest statement about fusion, and it's made quietly and by omission. The most complex fusion in the series is the one whose components we never learn, because at a certain point it stops being relevant. At a certain point, the person in front of you is just the person in front of you, and that's all of them, or close enough to all of them, which might be the most honest thing to say about a show whose world expands considerably the longer you look at it. There are fusions in the background of crowd scenes that never get names. There are combinations implied by the existence of gem types that the show doesn't have time to dramatize. The universe Rebecca Sugar built is larger than what the show was able to show, and that largeness is part of what makes returning to it interesting. It's quite a lot when you lay them out end to end. From Garnet, who has been a love story since the very first episode without announcing it, to Bluebird, who is what happens when you build something on the wrong foundation. From Stevonnie, 2 people who discovered that being together could produce a third thing worth being, to the cluster, thousands of beings who had no say in being combined and whose existence is one of the darker questions the show asks about how we treat the things we've broken. What strikes me, coming back through all of it, is how consistent the underlying argument is, and how the show makes it through 21 different characters without ever having to explain it twice at full length, because each fusion is a new demonstration of the same truth. Sugilite and Malachite are both cautionary in very different ways. Sugilite is the risk of power sought for its own sake, of the experience of being more than yourself becoming something you chase rather than something that arises from genuine connection. Malachite is more complicated. Lapis chose it for reasons that were in some ways good, and still paid an enormous price, and the show doesn't resolve that neatly, because it can't. Some situations don't have clean resolutions. The show knows this. And there's the Sardonyx arc, which is the show being honest about something harder than either of those. That people who genuinely care about each other can still use their connection in ways that cause harm. Pearl didn't manipulate Garnet out of cruelty. She did it out of loneliness and need. Those are different things. And the difference matters. but it doesn't erase the harm. The show holds both of those truths at the same time without releasing the tension between them. Which is the right choice? Real relationships are complicated in that specific way, and stories that pretend otherwise don't actually help anyone understand their own lives. The off-colors, sitting somewhat apart from all of this, are the show's reminder that the stakes of fusion aren't only personal. For rhodonite and fluorite, being a fusion isn't a choice between versions of themselves. It is themselves. It is their survival. It is the only thing they have that Homeworld system couldn't take from them when it discarded them. There's a specific quality of dignity in that, which the show treats with consistent respect. And Garnet is there at the beginning and end of all of it. The fixed point that everything else orbits, still choosing ruby and sapphire, still being proof of what the show says is possible. There's something worth sitting within the image of the Crystal Temple. The home the show's characters live in is built in the shape of their greatest combined form. It's been visible in every establishing shot since the beginning. The show just let it be there, unremarked, until the moment it became meaningful. That's a very Steven Universe thing to do. Put the answer in plain sight at the very beginning and wait. What I keep coming back to is that every fusion in this show is specific. Garnet's shape is different from Malachite's. Smoky Quartz is different from Sardonyx. Stevonnie is different from Steg. None of them could be swapped out because each one is an accurate portrait of a particular relationship at a particular moment, and the portrait is only possible because the show commits fully to the metaphor rather than treating it as window dressing. That's not a small thing. It's actually quite rare in any medium to find a single concept that can carry romantic love and toxic codependency and healing and violation and joy all in the same coherent visual language, without any of those meanings canceling out the others. Steven Universe managed it, and the fusions are the evidence. If you'd like